Well, hello, boys and girls. We are continuing with our story of Howliday Inn. I'm going to back up just a couple sentences to get us going into the story again. Well, I exclaimed, Toby told me that while the family goes on vacation, you and I are going to be boarded. Boarded, Chester exclaimed, his mellowness suddenly gone with the passing breeze. We're going to be boarded? I can't believe they do this to us. It figures. That's all I can say. It just figures. What figures? I asked. What are they going to do to us? Oh, just lock us up and throw away the key. That's all. Prison, Harold, that's what it boils down to. We're in their way now that they want to go off and have some fun. So out the door we go and into some dank, dark pit where we'll be fed moldy bread and rainwater, if we're lucky. You don't know what these places are like, Harold, but I do. How? I asked. Were you ever boarded? Was I ever boarded? Was I ever boarded? That's what I asked, Chester. Were you ever boarded? I've read Charles Dickens' sport, was his only reply, and he turned his attention to his tail, which he suddenly felt compelled to bathe. A scowl grew on his face, and I thought that if it were possible, dark rain clouds would have formed around his eyebrows. I'll tell you something else, Harold, he muttered. His hysteria had subsided, and he spoke in a low, serious tone. What's that? You have to keep your eyes open all the time in places like those. You never know what will happen next. What do you mean? I asked. Well, think about it, he went on. A group of strangers, all thrown together by circumstances. Who knows who they are, where they've come from, what they're doing there? The one smiling at you across the food dish in the morning could murder you in your sleep at night. Chester, I said, interrupting, I think perhaps your imagination is running away with you. Ha! Chester snorted. Mark my words, Harold. Keep your eyes open and your doors shut. Just remember, they aren't called strangers for nothing. And he walked away, leaving me alone with my thoughts. With everything Chester had said about strangers, it was hard for me at that moment to picture anyone stranger than Chester. But time would possibly bear out his warning. And I have to admit that even then, there was something in the conviction with which he spoke that made me uneasy. So much so that when I saw Mr. Monroe coming in my direction, I was immediately distrustful. And this of a man whose home I had lived in for years, and whose running shoes I had been eating but moments before. Hey there, Harold, guess what? You're going away on a little vacation. Aren't you lucky? I smelled a con job and kept my distance. You and Chester are going to stay in a nice animal hotel for a few days. You'll meet some new friends and have lots of fun. Doesn't that sound terrific? Interesting he doesn't mention the food, I thought. Having no intention of being conned into living on mold and rainwater, I decided to try a tactic I save only for the most dire of circumstances. As pitifully as I knew how, I started to whimper. "Aw, poor Harold," Mr. Monroe said quietly, reaching down to pat me on the top of my head. I was sure I had him hooked. "I wish we could take you with us, fella, but we can't." "Rats," Besides, you'll have a good time at Chateau Bow Wow. Doesn't that sound like a nice place to stay? Now, come on, boy, he said, moving back toward the driveway. Jump up here into the back of the station wagon. Chateau Bow Wow, I thought as I followed him. Doesn't sound so bad. Not the Waldorf Astoria, maybe, but not bad. Still, I wasn't sure I wanted to go anywhere, particularly after everything Chester had just told me. I lifted my head and let out a soft, muted moan. When I dropped my head again, I noticed Chester lying under the car in the shade by the rear tire. He looked at me and shook his head slowly. What a disgusting display, he said, sighing heavily. But what can one expect from a dog, after all? Well, I replied, I'm glad to see that you're so resigned to being dragged off to prison. I'm not resigned, he said calmly, licking a paw. I'm not going. Oh, really? I asked. And just how do you intend to manage that? Before he could answer, Mrs. Monroe came out of the front door with Chester's carrier, a large square box with a little window in one end. I always tell Chester that it looks like he's on television when he's inside. He doesn't find that very amusing. In fact, just the sight of his carrier is usually enough to send him into a panic, hissing and hyperventilating up a storm. This time, however, he seemed determined to remain cool. Toby, Mrs. Monroe instructed her youngest son, see if you and Pete can find Chester, will you? Pete appeared at the door behind Toby. Excuse me, Chester said to me. It's time for my exit. And so saying, he made a mad dash for the nearest lilac bush. Unfortunately for him, Toby and Pete were on to his favorite hiding places, and Pete, who had taken up jogging with his dad, was fast on Chester's heels, grabbing him by the tail. Not the best place to grab anyone, let alone a cat. Pete yanked him back and into his arms before Chester could do much more than let out a yelp of disapproval. Pete then attempted to force Chester into the waiting carrier, but Chester spread out all four of his legs so that his paws tightly clamped the edges of the box. With his legs held rigidly in place, he screamed and he hissed and he generally let it be known in no uncertain terms that he had no intention of going anywhere. All, however, was to no avail, for he was quickly surrounded by the entire Monroe family, and before he knew what had happened, he was squashed into the carrier and plopped into the car. I, on the other hand, went with quiet dignity, allowing myself to be lured into the back of the station wagon by a chocolate cupcake and Mrs. Monroe's calm affirmation that adventure was good for the soul. Chester and I had a few moments alone before the rest of the family joined us. Licking the last traces of chocolate frosting from the tip of my nose, I turned to the beast growling inside the cat carrier. I was intrigued by Mr. Monroe's statement about the effect of adventure on the soul, and thought perhaps I could pass the time engaging Chester in a deep philosophical conversation. Well, Chester, I began, what do you think? I think you made a fool of yourself over that cupcake, he said. Then again, I thought, perhaps not. I decided to try another tack. You know, Chester, I said, trying to sound cheerful, maybe there's nothing for us to worry about. The way Mr. Monroe tells it, Chateau Bow Wow sounds like a really nice place. Chester, who had been grumbling under his breath all this time, was suddenly silent. What did you say? He asked after a moment. I said, Chateau Bow Wow sounds like a really nice place. Chateau Bow Wow? Chateau Bow Wow! Chester's face appeared in the window. His eyes were gleaming. What's the problem? I asked. Oh, there's no problem. No problem at all. Just because I'm being forced to spend a week of my life in a place obviously run by dog chauvinists who are totally insensitive to my feline feelings. Why should that bother me? No, I don't have a problem, Harold. It's the rest of the world who has the problems. Gee, you know, Chester, I said to him, you look just like a guest on a talk show. Harold, have you heard one word I've said? Chester, could you pretend you're on a talk show? You know, just say, gee, it's swell to be here today, Marv, or, well, you know, Mike, it's funny you should ask about that. Okay? Okay, Chester, huh? Sing feelings, okay? Chester! Chester! Chester glared at me and dropped out of sight. I heard him muttering something about dogs, but I couldn't understand what he was saying. I stopped trying after the Monroes had gotten into the car, and I noticed we were pulling out of the driveway. There was a rumble of thunder in the distance as the car went over a bump and my stomach lurched. Why, I asked myself, had I eaten that chocolate cupcake? I closed my eyes and gritted my teeth. Toby and Pete were fighting about who had the best window. Mrs. Monroe was trying to quiet them down, at the same time pointing out to Mr. Monroe that he had just taken a wrong turn. Chester, meanwhile, was grumbling and hissing inside the carrier. Mark my words, Harold, I heard him say at one point. There's trouble ahead. Don't say I didn't warn you. As I was looking back on the feelings of peace and contentment with which I'd started the day, Mr. Monroe turned up the volume on the radio. So the outlook for the rest of the week, the announcer was saying, is heavy rain and thunderstorms. Everyone groaned. The car hit another bump, and my stomach began to feel like a washing machine on the spin cycle. This adventure, I thought, may be terrific for my soul, but it's going to wreak havoc on my digestive system.